In the cold, unforgiving walls of the Tower of London, a 19-year-old girl spent her final hours practicing how to die. Catherine Howard, Queen of England for barely 18 months, rehearsed placing her head upon the executioner's block, determined to meet her fate with dignity rather than the hysteria that had marked her imprisonment. What crime could warrant such a horrific end for someone so young? The answer lies not just in her alleged adultery, but in the ruthless political machine of Henry VIII's court, where youth, beauty and innocence were merely commodities to be consumed and discarded. Catherine Howard's story is one of the darkest chapters in Tudor history, a tale that reveals the terrifying reality of life under one of England's most tyrannical monarchs. Born into the powerful Howard family around 1523, she was thrust into a world where women existed solely to serve the ambitions of men, their bodies and lives considered expendable in the pursuit of power. Her brief reign as Henry's fifth wife would end in accusations of treason, torture of her associates, and ultimately her own execution on a cold February morning in 1542. This is not merely a story of royal scandal, but a window into the savage machinery of Tudor justice, where confessions were extracted through agony, where the young and vulnerable were sacrificed to protect the powerful, and where the king's paranoia transformed personal relationships into capital crimes. Catherine Howard's final days reveal the true cost of Henry VIII's reign of terror and the horrifying ease with which absolute power could destroy innocent lives. The England of 1540 was a nation transformed by religious upheaval and political terror. Henry VIII, now in his late 40s, had already broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and executed 2 wives in his relentless pursuit of a male heir. The court had become a dangerous maze of competing factions, where survival depended on navigating the king's increasingly erratic moods and paranoid suspicions. The Howards, one of England's most ancient noble families, saw an opportunity to restore their influence by placing their young kinswoman Catherine before the aging king's eyes. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless chief minister, had just engineered the king's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, and his enemies sensed weakness. The Howard faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, began positioning Catherine as a potential replacement for the unwanted German princess. They understood Henry's weakness for young, vivacious women who could make him feel virile again, despite his increasingly grotesque appearance and foul-smelling leg ulcers that made him a figure of revulsion rather than desire. The timing seemed perfect for the Howard family's ambitions. Cromwell's star was falling, and religious conservatives saw a chance to reverse the Protestant reforms that had swept England. Catherine, with her beauty and Catholic connections, represented hope for those who longed for a return to the old faith. What they failed to consider was the king's growing instability and his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his authority or wounded his pride. England in 1540 was a police state where informants lurked in every corner, where private conversations could become evidence of treason, and where the king's subjects lived in constant fear of the knock on the door that could mean death. The court itself had become a gilded prison where courtiers smiled while plotting each other's destruction, and where the king's favor could transform overnight into a death sentence. Catherine Howard's childhood had been a study in neglect and exploitation that would ultimately lead to her destruction. Orphaned at a young age when her father died, she was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess's residence at Chesworth House and later Horsham was supposed to provide young Catherine with the education and moral guidance befitting a nobleman's daughter. Instead, it became a place where she was exposed to adult relationships and sexual knowledge far beyond her years. The Dowager Duchess, an elderly woman more interested in her own affairs than properly supervising the young women in her care, allowed Catherine to share a dormitory with older girls who introduced her to the dangerous world of secret romances and clandestine meetings. It was here that Catherine first learned the skills that would later be used against her: how to conduct secret relationships, how to write love letters, and how to navigate the complex world of sexual politics that governed aristocratic households. Her first serious relationship was with Henry Manox, her music teacher, a man significantly older than the 13-year-old Catherine. This relationship, which likely involved sexual contact, established a pattern that would haunt her for the rest of her short life. Manox, understanding the power he held over his young pupil, introduced her to physical intimacy while simultaneously teaching her to deceive her guardians about their meetings. When the relationship with Manox ended, Catherine quickly became involved with Francis Derham, a gentleman pensioner in the Duchess's household. Their relationship was far more serious, involving not only physical intimacy, but also promises of marriage and the exchange of gifts. They called each other husband and wife, and many witnesses later testified that they believed a binding betrothal had taken place between them. The dormitory at Horsham became a place of whispered conversations and shared secrets, where young women learned to navigate the dangerous waters of desire and ambition. Catherine's roommates later testified to the casual attitude towards sexuality that prevailed in the household, where secret meetings were common, and the elderly Duchess remained willfully ignorant of the activities occurring under her roof. These early relationships would later be weaponized against Catherine, transformed from youthful indiscretions into evidence of her supposed immoral character. The very experiences that should have been protected by responsible adults became the foundation for accusations of promiscuity and deception that would ultimately cost her her life. The investigation that would destroy Catherine Howard began not with her actions as queen, but with a systematic examination of her past that revealed the inadequacy of her guardians and the inappropriate relationships that had marked her youth. This pattern of early sexual relationships, normal for many young women of her class but devastating when examined through the lens of royal scandal, became the first pillar of the case against her. By 1540, Catherine Howard had caught the attention of Henry VIII, but the path to becoming his fifth wife was paved with the debris of his previous marriages and the bodies of those who had crossed him. The king's pattern with wives had become disturbingly predictable: initial infatuation, passionate courtship, rapid marriage, and then either death or annulment when they failed to produce the desired male heir or when his interest waned. Catherine's rise to prominence came at a moment when Henry was particularly vulnerable to flattery and the illusion of renewed youth. His fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves had been a disaster from the moment he laid eyes on his Flanders mare, as he cruelly nicknamed her. The marriage had never been consummated, and Henry was eager for an annulment that would free him to pursue more appealing options. The Howard family understood the king's psychology perfectly. They had already provided him with one wife, Anne Boleyn, who had met her end on the executioner's block after failing to produce a male heir. Now they were willing to risk another young woman in their family, betting that Catherine's youth and beauty could succeed where Anne had failed. Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, orchestrated her introduction to court life with calculated precision. She was given a position as a maid of honor to Anne of Cleves, putting her directly in the king's path while he was most dissatisfied with his current marriage. Her beauty, vivacity, and apparent innocence provided a stark contrast to the foreign queen he was desperate to divorce. The king's courtship of Catherine was both pathetic and terrifying, a display of an aging tyrant's desperate attempt to recapture his youth through the conquest of a teenager. Henry, now grossly overweight, suffering from painful leg ulcers, and prone to violent mood swings, showered gifts upon the young woman who seemed to find him attractive despite his obvious physical and emotional deterioration. Catherine, barely 17, and with no understanding of the political forces manipulating her life, found herself the object of the most powerful man in England's obsessive attention. The Howard family coached her in how to respond to the king's advances, teaching her to be flirtatious but not too forward, innocent but not naive, and always mindful of the ultimate goal of marriage and the restoration of Howard power. The speed with which Henry moved from annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves to marrying Catherine Howard reveals the extent of his infatuation and his inability to think rationally when consumed by desire. Within weeks of his annulment being finalized, Catherine found herself Queen of England, a position that brought with it not just incredible privilege, but also unimaginable danger. Catherine's wedding to Henry VIII took place in July 1540, just weeks after his marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, in a ceremony that was both a celebration and a funeral march. The 19-year-old bride was marrying a man nearly 30 years her senior, whose previous wives had met fates that ranged from annulment to execution. The Howard family celebrated their return to power, while Catherine herself seemed to understand little of the historical precedent she was following. The early months of Catherine's queenship appeared to be a success. Henry, reinvigorated by his young wife's apparent affection, seemed happier than he had been in years. He showered her with gifts, including jewels that had belonged to his previous wives, a macabre recycling of royal treasures that spoke to his callous attitude toward the women he had discarded. Catherine embraced her role as queen with the enthusiasm of youth, delighting in the ceremonies, the beautiful clothes, and the power that came with her position. She intervened on behalf of prisoners, including some who had been condemned for religious reasons, showing a compassionate nature that initially endeared her to many at court. However, the very qualities that had attracted Henry to Catherine also made her vulnerable to the dangerous currents of court life. Her youth and inexperience made her an easy target for those who sought to manipulate her for their own purposes, while her natural warmth and friendliness were misinterpreted as flirtation by men who saw opportunity in her apparent accessibility. The king's health during this period was deteriorating rapidly, making him increasingly irritable and suspicious. His leg ulcers had become so infected that the smell was noticeable to everyone around him, and his weight had ballooned to the point where he required mechanical assistance to mount his horse. These physical ailments contributed to violent mood swings that made him unpredictable and dangerous. Catherine's inability to become pregnant quickly became a source of anxiety for both her and her family. Henry's desperate need for a male heir had already cost 2 wives their lives, and the pressure on Catherine to conceive was enormous. The failure to quickly produce an heir created an atmosphere of tension that made every aspect of her behavior subject to scrutiny and suspicion. The Queen's household, like all royal establishments, was filled with spies and informants who reported every conversation and interaction to various political factions. Catherine's every word was analyzed for signs of disloyalty or inappropriate behavior, while her private moments were invaded by servants whose primary loyalty was not to her, but to those who paid for information about her activities. The fatal attraction that would ultimately destroy Catherine Howard came in the form of Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, whose proximity to power and undeniable charm made him irresistible to a young woman trapped in a marriage to an increasingly repugnant husband. Culpeper, roughly Catherine's age and possessed of the vitality and attractiveness that Henry had long since lost, represented everything that was missing from her marriage to the king. Their relationship began innocently enough, with casual conversations and shared glances that gradually evolved into something far more dangerous. Culpeper had the advantage of regular access to the royal apartments through his position in the king's household, and he used this access to pursue a relationship with the Queen that both of them knew was potentially fatal. The secret meetings between Catherine and Culpeper were facilitated by Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who had survived the destruction of the Boleyn family, only to involve herself in another queen's downfall. Jane, the widow of George Boleyn, who had been executed alongside Anne Boleyn, should have understood better than anyone the dangers of royal scandal, yet she willingly served as the go-between for the clandestine romance. Catherine's letters to Culpeper, written in her own hand, would later become key evidence in her trial. These documents revealed not just romantic feelings, but also a level of intimacy that could be interpreted as treasonous. Her written words, "It makes my heart to die, to think what fortune I have, that I cannot be always in your company," would be used to paint her as an adulteress who had betrayed both her marriage vows and her duty to the crown. The meetings themselves took place in a variety of locations, from the Queen's private chambers to secluded spots during royal progresses. The participants went to elaborate lengths to conceal their activities, using coded messages and trusted intermediaries to arrange their encounters. These precautions, while necessary for their safety, also provided evidence of premeditation that would later be used against them. Culpeper's motivations in pursuing the relationship remain unclear. Whether he was genuinely infatuated with the Queen, seeking political advantage, or simply enjoying the thrill of the forbidden liaison, his actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for the consequences that awaited anyone who dared to cuckold the King of England. The relationship progressed over several months with increasing boldness and decreasing caution. What began as stolen glances and brief conversations evolved into lengthy private meetings and passionate correspondence. Both Catherine and Culpeper seemed to lose sight of the mortal danger they were courting, caught up in the intensity of their feelings and the excitement of their secret romance. The walls began closing in on Catherine Howard in October 1541, when her past finally caught up with her in the most devastating way possible. The revelation of her previous relationships and current affair came not through careful investigation, but through the desperate actions of John Lascelles, a reformer who saw an opportunity to strike at the Catholic Howard faction by exposing the Queen's secrets. Lascelles approached Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury and a key Protestant leader, with information about Catherine's past relationships. His sister, Mary Hall, had been a servant in the Dowager Duchess's household and had witnessed Catherine's relationships with both Henry Manox and Francis Dereham. The timing of this revelation was particularly damaging, coming just as Henry was celebrating what he believed to be his happy marriage. Cranmer faced a terrible dilemma. He knew that bringing such accusations to the king could result in another royal execution, but he also understood that failing to report potential treason could cost him his own life. After much deliberation, he decided to present the information to Henry in the form of a letter, allowing the king to read the accusations privately rather than hearing them spoken aloud. Henry's reaction to the revelations was initially one of disbelief and rage. He refused to accept that his young wife, who seemed to adore him, could have deceived him so completely. His first instinct was to punish the messenger, but as more evidence emerged, his disbelief transformed into the cold fury that had marked his previous dealings with unfaithful wives. The investigation that followed was conducted with the same methodical brutality that had characterized Henry's previous marital scandals. Francis Dereham and Henry Manox were arrested and interrogated under torture, their confessions extracted through the application of the rack and other instruments of agony. Their testimony provided detailed accounts of their relationships with Catherine, painting her as a willing participant in sexual relationships that began when she was barely a teenager. Thomas Culpeper's arrest followed shortly after, and his interrogation revealed the extent of his relationship with the Queen. Under torture, he admitted to meeting with Catherine privately, but denied that their relationship had been consummated. Whether his confession was truthful or simply designed to minimize his guilt while under extreme duress remains unclear. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was also arrested for her role in facilitating the meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. Her interrogation revealed the elaborate precautions taken to conceal the relationship and the extent to which she had served as an intermediary between the lovers. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing the premeditated nature of the alleged adultery. Catherine Howard's final imprisonment began on November 14th, 1541, when she was confined to her apartments while the investigation into her conduct continued. The young queen, who just months before had been the center of court celebrations and royal favor, found herself completely isolated, with only a small number of carefully selected servants allowed to attend her. The conditions of her confinement were designed to break her spirit and extract a full confession. She was denied access to writing materials, prevented from communicating with anyone outside her immediate household, and subjected to constant interrogation by the king's commissioners. The psychological pressure was as deliberate and calculated as any physical torture. Catherine's emotional state during this period deteriorated rapidly. Witnesses reported that she alternated between periods of hysteria and catatonic silence, unable to comprehend how completely her world had collapsed. The young woman who had once commanded the resources of an entire kingdom was now powerless to influence even the smallest aspects of her daily routine. The interrogations focused not just on her recent relationship with Culpeper, but also on her past relationships and her failure to disclose them before her marriage to the king. The commissioners were particularly interested in establishing whether she had entered into a binding betrothal with Francis Derham, which would have made her subsequent marriage to Henry invalid and potentially treasonous. Catherine's responses to questioning were inconsistent and often contradictory, reflecting both her emotional distress and her genuine confusion about the legal implications of her past relationships. Her youth and lack of education made her particularly vulnerable to the sophisticated legal arguments being constructed against her, and she struggled to understand how actions she had considered private matters could be transformed into evidence of treason. The Queen's physical health also began to deteriorate under the strain of her confinement. She lost weight rapidly, suffered from insomnia, and developed a nervous condition that made her hands shake uncontrollably. These physical symptoms were carefully documented by her guards, as even her bodily responses to stress were considered potential evidence of her guilt. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Catherine's fate had already been decided. The king's previous pattern with unfaithful wives left little doubt about the outcome, and the only remaining question was whether she would be granted the mercy of a private execution or subjected to the public spectacle of being burned at the stake as a traitor. The legal machinery that would destroy Catherine Howard was set in motion with the same ruthless efficiency that had characterized Henry VIII's previous matrimonial scandals. Parliament was summoned to pass a bill of attainder against the Queen, a legislative process that would condemn her without the need for a formal trial where she might have been able to present a defense. The bill of attainder represented a corruption of English legal tradition, allowing the king to bypass normal judicial procedures when dealing with cases that touched on royal prerogative. Catherine would be condemned not by a jury of her peers, but by a parliament that existed entirely at the king's pleasure and dared not oppose his will. The charges against Catherine were carefully crafted to ensure her destruction while avoiding any admission that the king himself had been deceived or made an error in judgment. She was accused of concealing her previous relationships before marriage, engaging in adultery with Thomas Culpeper, and conspiring to imagine the king's death through her treasonous conduct. The evidence presented against her included the testimony of her former lovers, extracted under torture, her own letters to Culpeper, and the testimony of servants who had witnessed or facilitated her secret meetings. This evidence was presented as proof of a deliberate conspiracy to deceive the king and betray the crown. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham faced their own trials and condemnations, with both men ultimately being sentenced to the traditional traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Culpeper, perhaps because of his higher social status or the king's residual affection for him, was granted the mercy of simple beheading, while Derham suffered the full brutality of the traitor's execution. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, presented a unique legal problem because she appeared to have suffered a complete mental breakdown during her imprisonment, and English law traditionally held that insane persons could not be executed. Parliament solved this inconvenience by passing a special statute declaring that madness was no defense against treason, clearing the way for her execution. The Bill of Attainder against Catherine passed both Houses of Parliament without significant opposition, as no member dared to speak in defence of a queen whom the king had already condemned. The speed and unanimity of the parliamentary process demonstrated the complete subservience of England's legislative body to Henry's tyrannical will. Catherine Howard's final days in the Tower of London revealed both the cruelty of Tudor justice and the remarkable courage of a young woman facing certain death. Transferred to the Tower on February 10, 1542, she was confined in the same rooms that had held Anne Boleyn 6 years earlier, a deliberate psychological torture that emphasized the fate awaiting unfaithful queens. The Tower's Lieutenant, Sir John Gage, was instructed to treat Catherine with the respect due to her royal status while ensuring that she could not escape or harm herself before her execution. This delicate balance between courtesy and security created an atmosphere of surreal politeness surrounding the preparation for judicial murder. Catherine's behavior during her final days surprised many who had known her only as a frivolous young woman interested primarily in clothes and court festivities. Faced with the certainty of death, she displayed a dignity and composure that impressed even her guards. She spent her time in prayer, reading religious texts, and preparing herself spiritually for the end that awaited her. The young queen's most poignant request during this period was for the executioner's block to be brought to her room so that she could practice placing her head upon it correctly. This macabre rehearsal was motivated by her desire to die with dignity, rather than the hysteria that had marked some previous royal executions. She reportedly spent hours perfecting the positioning that would allow the headsman to complete his work efficiently. Catherine's final letters, dictated to her attendants since she was denied writing materials, expressed genuine remorse for her actions while maintaining her innocence of the most serious charges against her. She acknowledged her failure to disclose her past relationships before marriage, but denied that she had committed adultery as queen or conspired against the king's life. The condemned queen also used her final days to make provision for her servants, requesting that they be cared for after her death and expressing gratitude for their loyal service during her imprisonment. This concern for others in the face of her own approaching doom revealed a maturity and selflessness that had not been evident during her brief reign. On the evening of February 12, 1542, Catherine was informed that her execution would take place the following morning. She spent her final night in prayer and meditation, refusing offers of food but accepting the spiritual comfort provided by the priests who attended her. Her composure during these final hours would be remembered as the most admirable aspect of her short and tragic life. The execution of Catherine Howard on February 13, 1542, was conducted with the same grim efficiency that had characterized Henry VIII's previous judicial murders, but it also revealed the extraordinary courage of a 19-year-old girl facing death with remarkable composure. The execution was scheduled for dawn to minimize the number of witnesses and reduce the potential for public sympathy for the condemned queen. Catherine was led to the scaffold within the tower's walls, the same location where Anne Boleyn had met her fate 6 years earlier. The executioner was an expert imported from France, chosen for his skill in ensuring a quick and clean death, rather than the botched beheadings that sometimes resulted from using inexperienced headsmen. The small crowd of witnesses included tower officials, representatives of the king, and a few courtiers whose presence was required by protocol. Catherine's own servants were allowed to attend, and their later accounts provided the most detailed descriptions of her final moments. Dressed in a black velvet gown and white coif, Catherine approached the scaffold with steady steps and no visible signs of fear. Her practiced positioning on the block demonstrated the care she had taken to prepare for this moment, and her composure impressed even those who had come to witness her disgrace, rather than her courage. Catherine's final speech was brief and followed the traditional formula expected of royal executions. She acknowledged her offenses against the king, asked for prayers for her soul, and forgave those who had brought about her destruction. She made no attempt to proclaim her innocence or appeal for mercy, understanding that such gestures would be futile and might only prolong her suffering. The execution itself was completed with a single stroke, the French executioner demonstrating the skill for which he had been chosen. Catherine Howard died instantly. Her suffering ended after months of imprisonment, interrogation, and psychological torture. She was buried immediately in an unmarked grave within the tower's chapel, joining Anne Boleyn and others who had fallen victim to Henry's matrimonial paranoia. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was executed shortly after Catherine, her own death completing the destruction of all the principal figures in the scandal. Her execution, coming despite her apparent madness, demonstrated the lengths to which Henry would go to eliminate anyone connected to his wife's alleged betrayal. Catherine Howard's death marked the end of the Howard family's brief return to power and influence. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was himself later condemned to death for treason, though he was saved only by Henry's own death on the night before his scheduled execution. The family's repeated involvement in royal scandals had finally exhausted even Henry's tolerance for their ambitions. The brutal efficiency of Catherine's execution and the methodical destruction of everyone connected to her alleged crimes revealed the true nature of Henry VIII's reign. This was not justice, but the arbitrary exercise of absolute power, where the king's wounded pride was sufficient justification for the judicial murder of a teenager whose greatest crime may have been falling in love with someone her own age. The aftermath of Catherine Howard's execution reverberated through English society, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers that faced anyone who dared to cross Henry VIII or become entangled in the treacherous world of royal marriage. The speed and thoroughness with which the king had eliminated his fifth wife sent a clear message to his subjects about the consequences of real or perceived betrayal. Parliament, having obediently passed the Bill of Attainder that condemned Catherine without trial, quickly moved to address the legal implications of the king's latest matrimonial disaster. New laws were enacted, making it treasonous for any woman to marry the king without first disclosing her complete sexual history, a statute that revealed the paranoia and insecurity underlying Henry's relationships with women. The religious implications of Catherine's fall were equally significant. Her Catholic relatives had hoped that her influence would lead to a restoration of traditional religious practices, but her disgrace and execution instead strengthened the position of Protestant reformers who had orchestrated her downfall. The Howard family's humiliation became a victory for those who supported England's break with Rome. Henry's reaction to Catherine's execution was characteristically callous and self-serving. Rather than expressing any remorse for the death of his teenage wife, he blamed her entirely for deceiving him and portrayed himself as the victim of feminine wiles and Catholic conspiracy. His ability to cast himself as the injured party while ordering the judicial murder of a 19-year-old girl demonstrated the complete absence of moral accountability that characterized his reign. The king's subsequent search for a sixth wife was influenced by the lessons learned from Catherine's case. His eventual marriage to Catherine Parr was preceded by exhaustive investigations into her background and character, and she was chosen partly because her maturity and Protestant convictions made her less likely to engage in the kind of romantic adventures that had doomed her predecessors. The broader impact on English society was profound, as Catherine's fate reinforced the absolute nature of royal authority and the powerlessness of even the highest-ranking subjects when they fell from favor. The aristocracy understood that neither noble birth nor royal marriage provided any protection against the king's wrath, leading to an atmosphere of fear and subservience that would characterize the remainder of Henry's reign. The historical legacy of Catherine Howard's execution continues to evolve as scholars reassess her story and its implications. Modern historians have increasingly questioned the traditional narrative that portrayed her as a promiscuous adulteress who brought about her own destruction through immoral behavior and poor judgment. Contemporary feminist scholarship has reframed Catherine's story as that of a victim of systematic abuse and exploitation, beginning with her inappropriate sexual relationships as a young teenager and culminating in her judicial murder at the hands of a tyrannical husband. This interpretation emphasizes the power imbalances that shaped her life and the impossibility of meaningful consent in her relationships with older, more powerful men. The question of Catherine's actual guilt remains contentious among historians. While her past relationships before marriage are well documented, the evidence for adultery with Thomas Culpeper is less conclusive. Her letters to him, while intimate in tone, do not explicitly admit to physical adultery, and Culpeper's own confession under torture may have been designed to minimize his crimes rather than provide accurate testimony. The legal procedures used to condemn Catherine have been universally criticized by modern scholars as a perversion of justice that denied her basic rights to defense and due process. The use of parliamentary attainder rather than judicial trial, the acceptance of testimony extracted under torture, and the creation of new laws specifically designed to ensure her conviction all demonstrate the arbitrary nature of Tudor justice when it served royal purposes. Catherine's story has also been re-examined in the context of child sexual abuse, with many historians now recognizing that her early relationships with Henry Manox and Francis Dereham constituted statutory rape by modern standards. Her later behavior as queen can thus be understood not as evidence of inherent promiscuity, but as the predictable result of childhood trauma and exploitation. The broader implications of Catherine Howard's fate extend beyond her individual tragedy to illuminate the systematic oppression of women in Tudor society. Her story reveals how women's bodies and sexuality were treated as political commodities, subject to constant surveillance and control by male relatives, husbands, and the state itself. The enduring fascination with Catherine Howard's story reflects both its inherent drama and its continuing relevance to contemporary discussions about power, consent, and justice. Her brief life and violent death serve as a window into a world where youth and beauty could elevate a woman to the highest position in the land, only to become the instruments of her destruction when they failed to serve male ambitions and desires. Catherine Howard's story stands as one of history's most tragic examples of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how the innocent can be destroyed by forces beyond their understanding or control. Her fate reminds us that behind every historical statistic lies a human being whose suffering deserves to be remembered and understood, not merely as entertainment, but as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the vulnerability of those who lack power in societies that view them as expendable.